Episode of Harmonious at Lunch, the show that fuels your business success. I'm Brandon Gano, your host and guide through the world of harmonious business growth. Today, we're unlocking powerful strategies with industry experts to help your business thrive. If you're a business owner, entrepreneur, or executive, you are in the right place. Join me and our incredible guest today on the journey to clarity, growth, and success. It is time to revolutionize your approach to business. Let's dive in with another episode of Harmonious at Lunch. Welcome back into some more bite-sized business advice. In today's episode, we're talking about crisis communications. What is a crisis? First of all, we're going to paint that picture, but this is a topic that is so relevant, especially for small businesses, because we see this stuff in the news and we say, that'll never happen to me in my business, but what if, right? What if it does? What do you do? And how do you actually get in front of it so you can not be a victim of the crisis, but you can take control of it to the best degree possible? I have an amazing guest with me who's going to paint this picture for us. John David of David PR. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. I appreciate it.
So I'm excited for this conversation, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say about it. Crisis communication, this is a big thing. I think I want to start at the foundation, though, of what is a crisis, right? Because just this very morning, as of recording the show, I had a crisis. My 3-year-old got too many raisins in her plate, and there was a crisis in my house, but I don't think that's what we're talking about. So help me understand, what is a crisis in business?
So how many raisins is too many? One? In my house, it's probably one.
It was too many, then not enough, and it was this whole back and forth. There's no perfect amount.
To me, a crisis is relative, right? That's the main thing that when you think about a communications crisis for a business, for example, if you have a national company and you have an office in one part of the country, you have offices all over the country. You have an office in Austin, Seattle, St. Louis, whatever. And in one of those offices, one of your senior executives is accused of sexual harassment, right? If you're a big company, you can say, this is an isolated incident. This is one company. We've gotten rid of the person, whatever, right? You can make it's a problem. It's an embarrassment, for example, to this company, right? But if you're a smaller company or a small law firm and your managing partner is accused of sexual harassment, guess what? You have an existential crisis on your hands. So it's all relative what a crisis is. To sort of think that it has to be, that you have a national recall for your product, or that you have a system-wide, data breach that's impacting airline flights. Yes, those are the ones that are going to get the traditional national attention. But every business is vulnerable to having a crisis that could cause major damage to their reputation, to their brand, and ultimately to their company itself, the bottom line, their livelihood.
Yeah, and it's again, that's the perfect example, because if the data breach or whatever happened with the airlines recently, where it caused flight delays and all that stuff, and that was a couple months ago at the time that this episode is recording, but I'm sure you remember it. It was in the news, and there's probably been 7 others since then. It's a blip in the radar for those companies. It doesn't matter. They manage it. They move on. But for a small company, a small business, our audience here of listeners, if you have one thing that goes wrong, you could lose half of your customers, or you could lose the trust of half your customers, if not more, in one day or less. So the question becomes then, not that the big companies don't care, but it is easier to manage with stuff like that. For small businesses and entrepreneurs, where do we even go about starting to think about this? Because it could be so big.
Right. I mean, yeah, you can, I think most business owners think about what a dark day would be, that they think about it. And I had a client who had a jewelry business, had a jewelry store, and I thought he was in a really secure location, and I was talking to him about this, and he said, well, he goes, I stay up all night thinking about the 10,000 different ways I could get robbed, right? He's like, even though from my eyes I thought he was in a great spot, but he said I could see a million ways that I could have a problem. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think most businesses look forward, and they look at what can happen, what can, what could change their industry, change their business, that sort of thing. But when it comes to a crisis, you never really know, right? The big thing is to lay out some groundwork, some foundational things to start with. The first is that you should have the basics of a crisis plan. And that doesn't even have to be like a huge, massive, binder full of stuff. But one is that you have in place a way to communicate with all your stakeholders quickly, right? So think about something goes wrong. How are you going to reach out to all your employees, all your investors, all of your customers, anybody you want to? So now most companies have email lists and email blasts and all those things. So that might be fine. But do you have the phone numbers of all these people? Do you know how to reach out to them? It's the same thing you'd have in your emergency plan if you had, a hurricane approaching or that sort of thing, winter storm, stuff like that. You want to make sure you can communicate with everybody. Number one. Number two is that if you think in terms of, okay, something could happen and we could get some serious media coverage. Are we prepared for that in the simplest of ways? Do we have a media policy in place with our company? And a media policy is really simple, a simple document, which essentially, you can pop it into your employee manual, and it's just a policy that reminds your employees that they're not a spokesperson for your company. So something happens at it's your office in, New Jersey, that and a reporter shows up. And the people who work in New Jersey know that, listen, I'm not a spokesman for the company, but let me tell you who you can reach out to. And that's media policy should say, remember, you're not a spokesperson for our company, but if someone reaches out to you, contact these people. And maybe it's the HR team or the communications team, or it's an external consultant. I happen to be in several of those media policies for my clients. My phone number's in there. Something happens, they can call me, right? So you have a policy in place. And then the next part is to do a little gaming of gamification, I guess, of your situation. What could go wrong? What could happen? What could be a problem for our company, our business? And that could be everything from, like we're talking about, there's and again, it's all relative. So if you're a small company and all of a sudden your CEO is departing and you don't know who's going to replace him, there's a succession issue. That's a crisis. It's a crisis of confidence among investors and among your customers. There's also, if you have like a lawsuit against you for some reason, someone files a suit against you and they, it could be anything from intellectual property to sexual harassment, whatever. And then the other issues are things, think about, okay, what if there's workplace violence? What are we going to do? What if we have, in a particular business, what if there's a massive supply chain problem? Okay. I mean, these are things. What if there's, and the one that happens very commonly now, what if there's a data breach or some type of communications problem that impedes your ability to operate? So you can kind of game out and say, okay, here's my worst case scenario. And then if that were to happen, what would I do? And so that's one thing that a small business can do to prepare for a potential crisis.
Yeah, I feel like two things pop into my mind. First and foremost, I feel like everything you just said is a giant plug for our business. What if? We like to be a little bit more positive when we ask that question, but in this situation, it's very true. You do have to be prepared for those what ifs. I think even there's an insurance company, like a big, I think it's maybe an Allstate or something, that has a whole segment on what ifs, and that's really what we're talking about here. And the other piece is, I remember now as you were talking, this was maybe 15 or so years ago. My dad was first getting into business. He was going to be going from W-2 employee to a business owner. And he made one of these disaster plans. And I was like, at the time, like, what are you doing? Like, this is crazy that you're putting all this effort into thinking about all the things that could go wrong. And he had everything in that plan that you just mentioned. And he came from, I'm putting pieces together. He came from an insurance industry background.
Sure.
So why is it that most entrepreneurs fail to even think about this? And what can those people, like, what is the first baby step that they can do to say, all right, if one of these what ifs come up, I have at least a skeleton of an idea of what to do.
Right. Well, okay. So the first part of your question of like, why don't business owners do that? I think one reason is because they're, I mean, when I went started my own consulting business, like I read one business book, and it was called The Idiot's Guide to Starting Your Own Business.
Oh, then you're good.
And
That's all you need.
I read no, but I read it, and I was terrified after I read it. I'm like, oh my God, because it was all these things that you should do for your business. This is like, oh my God, it's gonna be so hard. And I felt like it was taking away my momentum. Like I was like, it was discouraging me from pursuing my dream. And I think it's also, so that's one thing I think, just philosophically. And I think for small business owners, I think they just have to, I think you think about it in terms like you say insurance, right? I think you're referring back to like the Allstate Mayhem guy, those commercials where
like that.
all these crazy things happen. And I think for small businesses, they have to, you're not really being responsible if you don't think about all the things that can happen. And one of my clients, whenever I speak to him about his business, he always reminds me of how many people he employs and that they all have families. And he says, listen, we make decisions, that impact thousands of families. So and he goes, I take that responsibility very seriously. So I think most small business owners, even though they may not feel like they're responsible for thousands of families or thousands of people, that they do have, whatever, dozens or hundreds of customers and stakeholders, and they want to make sure you're doing the best possible job you can for them. And then also, it's also about self-preservation, because a communications crisis can knock you out of business. I mean, it can, you can end up with a situation where, you lose clients because they don't like the way you handle this particular situation.
Yeah, no, that's completely fair. And I think that's exactly right. The two things you said, when you first start your business, when you are a solopreneur, very easy to put this stuff off because there's not thousands of families depending on you. And even if you have a bunch of customers, it's easy to just say, okay, that's fine, I'll manage it, we'll get there. But the other part too, I see a lot of times where the entrepreneurs, they're the out there thinkers, right? They're the dreamers and the visionaries, and they don't want to be bogged down by all this negative stuff, so we just put it off. But it really is so important. So I'm curious if you could paint this picture for us in real life examples. Do you have an example of maybe someone you've worked with who had a plan in place, managed it, went as well as it could, because obviously we're talking about crisis, so something did go wrong, but on the flip side of that, maybe someone out there in the real world, some other company who just totally fumbled the ball with a crisis management situation. I'm curious to see, side by side, what that looks like in real life terms.
Sure. So as an example, I represent a nonprofit group, and they're heavily it's I guess the best way to describe it is they're an activist group. And so they had a situation when the October 7th attacks happened in Israel, and they literally enacted their crisis communications plan because they wanted to make sure that they wanted to get their messaging out. And the first step of the plan was to get all their communications people together in one place. In this case, it was a Zoom call, and then they had a list of these are the 5 or 6 different pieces of communication that we want to get out to our stakeholders, right? And so they actually kicked their crisis communications plan into action, on a Saturday morning, and off they went to making sure that their audience knew their position on what was happening in the world. And so it's not a crazy thing to sit there and again, you don't have to come up and know exactly what's going to happen, but you have all your pieces in place. If something goes wrong, who do I need to contact? I need to make sure I need to make sure I can contact all my customers. I need to make sure I can contact all my employees. Now, these days it's different, right? We have Slack and we have all these things, but we also have employees who are all far afield, right? They're not there. You can't call them. You can't get everybody into a conference room, like maybe you could years ago. So you have these situations arise where you can put your crisis plan into place and have it be effective. Now, where you end up the other side is when a company or an organization, kind of does the I hope it's going to go away scenario, and they don't address exactly what's happening. So those are typically the worst case scenarios. And so the guys who did it wrong are, if you ever watch, if you ever watch like 60 Minutes and you see these shows where, they show a guy, being interviewed that we've been trying to reach so-and-so executive, and they stick a microphone in his face, while he's coming out of his country club, and everybody says, oh my gosh, they ambushed this guy. I'm like, well, no, they didn't ambush this guy. They've actually been trying to reach this guy for months, and they want to get him on camera, and he's not even answering their calls. And so now they've decided we're going to go try to get this guy no matter what, because they're completely skirting their responsibility. So it's like whenever you see somebody like literally putting a microphone in somebody's face, it's usually because they were trying to run away and hide from it. And so you have these situations where the eventually you're going to have to come back. Eventually you're going to have to address what's going on. And so in the latest data breach, the company that had the big problem, they actually owned up to it right in the beginning, and then all the they said we had this, we had an issue with our software. They owned up to it right away. But then the aftermath was 10 times worse. They owned up to it in the morning, but there was still, these delays happened with airlines for days and weeks later and all those things. So the best solution is to try to address an issue right away. And so it gets to a few of the kind of rules of the road, which I think is also important, is that to me, the worst thing that you can do is basically say, no comment. But you sometimes you don't want to comment, right? But so the rules of engagement are such that you can actually have a conversation with a reporter or a journalist and say, listen, I'm going to give you a statement that's not going to say a whole heck of a lot, but we are working on this. We are trying to address this. We are trying to fix this. And once we have something more to tell you, we will let you know. And you can have conversations with reporters and explain that to them. And typically they're not out for blood. They're just out for information. So knowing the rules of engagement to dealing with the media is really helpful in a crisis situation. And that's an area where I see organizations that kind of flub it.
Oh, what does that look like from the reporter standpoint? Because not all of our businesses are going to be covered by even local news if something were to happen. Is that sending out consistent emails to your customer, or what are some forms of communication that would be equivalent for small businesses?
So I think the big thing is that you have to have the being silent about something. I mean, it can be tricky, because if you're having like a communications issue, or you have your systems are shut down for whatever reason because of it's a cyber attack, or it's a problem, or it's a software update that screws everything up, and you can't get the information out. That's a whole other issue. But to me, I think it's important that you reach out to your customers in the way that they're used to being communicated with, right? And then also through your own social channels. So if you're a retail outlet, you have customer lists, email them and tell them what's going on. Let them know what's happening, and here's who you can contact if you have further questions. And bonus points if you actually put a phone number in there where a human being will answer it. And then at the same time, publish information on your social media channels, on your Twitter feed or X feed, whatever it's called these days, Facebook page, LinkedIn, any other channels you're using, so that you're at least communicating, you're acknowledging that there's a problem, right? So the biggest thing is if you're calling and you're trying to, you're trying to reach the airline, and there's no, you get your call will be answered in 5 hours and 37 minutes. If you go onto their Twitter feed and they're saying, that actually happened to me. If you go onto the Twitter feed and they say, we are having this outage and we're working on it and we're trying to fix it, in what's apropos for today, the instance that you and I are talking now, there's, a hurricane just went through Florida and is now, raining on the East Coast. Right now, all these people are without power. And if you go to the websites of the power companies, they've gotten a lot better at telling you, here's what's going on. Here's where we can't send our trucks out until the wind goes below this amount. We know this many people are their power is out. We're working on it. We're expecting to restore this many per day. They've gotten 1,000 times better when it used to just be, if the power went out, they're like, we're aware. we'll let you know sometime in the future, right? So I've gotten a lot better at it. So the main thing with any business is that you have those communications channels open, and you're prepared to say, okay, if something happens, how am I going to communicate with my customers? If the power goes out at our headquarters, how am I going to, how are we going to communicate with everybody else? And now, because of the cloud and because of remote work and because of all these other things, it's not as tricky as it once was. But if you don't have sort of that plan in place, then you can struggle.
Yeah, I mean, everything you're saying, really, to me, it seems like we're just focused on this foundation of retaining, but also hopefully building trust with our customers should something happen. Is that the ultimate goal here?
Well, yeah, I mean, retaining trust, absolutely, and also, retaining your customers and keeping the integrity of your brand. Folks you've worked really hard. People have worked really hard. If you start a small business, what's happened? You've worked really hard in your life. You're now staking your reputation on yourself. You're betting on yourself, and so what do you want to have some third party action like knock you out? It's really it just makes perfect sense, but it's also something. It's like, yeah, no, most people don't like thinking about bad news. They don't like thinking about the negative stuff that can happen. And also it gets personal, when you're dealing with somebody who built a business and all of a sudden someone's saying, well, hey, you did this or this happened or whatever. What do you say? And they're like, well, it's like you're attacking their children. It's like, it's not, it's always going to be a challenge.
Yeah. Not a fun thing to think about, but definitely worth it. And it will pay off in the long run. Hopefully you never need to use it. Let's also put that in there too, that you hopefully will never need to cross this bridge, but
yeah,
should you, now you have a resource. So John, this was phenomenal. Where should the listeners reach out, or where do you have a resource to learn more about you?
Sure. My website's davidpr.com. That's really the easiest way to connect with me. All my contact forms and calendar appointments and phone number and everything's there. So it's easy way to reach me. And I communicate with my clients, whatever's easiest for them. So, and, I kind of, I'm available basically all the time, because that's what happens. It's like a client, I have one client that it seems like I get called on every major holiday. But it, so it goes. So
it's the nature of the business, right? Unfortunately.
Yes, sir. Yep. Indeed.
I love it. Well, I appreciate you having here. This was fantastic. The website's on the screen wherever you're watching or listening. It's down below in the show notes as well, so you can go check that out. Put a plan in place. Let's start to think about this. This is the one piece of business that I already said, and John echoed, most people do put off. For us at What If, it's part of our architecture, the harmonious architecture. It's the R, risk and defense. You have to think about all the things that could go wrong, that could attack your business, both from the inside or the outside, because if you don't, then you're just susceptible to having your whole business blow up at your face, and we don't want that. So subscribe. We want to have you back. Thanks for listening to Harmonious at Lunch. Let's continue to build a more harmonious business and life. We'll see you on tomorrow's episode.